Hello and welcome to the Methods and Functions workshop. My name is Noah Houchins, and we're going to talk about methods and functions. So let's say we wanted to count the number of times the letter A appears in a given string. How could we do that? Well, we could write the code string s equals, and then I've just got some random letters and whatnot here. Just copy this over. So let's say here's our string, and we want to count how many A's appear in this string. Well, we need a variable to count them. So we need an int count, and we haven't counted any A's so far. So we're going to set this equal to 0. And then we can use a while loop. I covered loops in the last workshop. Feel free to go back and watch that again. We're going to say while s dot contains, and we want to say as long as it contains the letter A, we're going to keep counting it. We're going to keep running this loop. So because we're in this loop, that means the string does contain the letter A. So we want our count to go up by 1. Count plus plus. Now we need to get rid of the A that appeared in the string. So we can say s equals s dot substring, and then we want the location of the A, which we can use s dot index of A. And now this will give us the location of the A, the first letter A that it finds, but we want to go one after that because we want to get rid of that A. So we're just going to do +1. Okay. Now, once this loop ends, we'll have the string will actually be altered by this, which sometimes is good, sometimes is bad. Someone asks, how do you know to use substring? That's a great question. So substring is a built-in function of the string class, and it allows you to get a smaller portion of the string within the current string, hence the name substring, sub meaning within. So whenever you're dealing with modifying a string, as in like, okay, I just want the second half of the string, or I want to get rid of the first, 5 letters or something like that, first 5. You're always going to be thinking in terms of substring. So most languages have a substring feature in them. Some of them are harder to use than others. For example, Python is super easy to do substring. You would just say like s equals whatever your string is, and then you would use the square brackets to say, how much of the string you want. So if I want the string to start at like 3, so starting with the third letter and then going forward, I would just do this. But substring is a very, very helpful command, and it's one that you'll learn to use in a lot of your code. I'm sure there are other ways that you could solve this problem. In fact, I know there are other ways where you wouldn't have to use substring. This is just the most straightforward way to do it, or at least the easiest to write. You could write it a different way by simply iterating over the string itself. So again, we covered arrays and loops in the last workshop, so feel free to go back and watch that again. We can say where I is less than s dot length. And now I will represent the index, each index or each letter in our string. So if you think of a string as just a big array, because that's essentially what it is, this first character is at index 0. And then H is at index 1, G is at index 2, so on and so on. So we could say if s dot char at I, so this is how we access, quote unquote, access the array of chars or characters. If the character at I is A, then we increment count. So these do the same thing in the sense that they're counting the number of A's. The difference is this one will actually modify our string variable, which is okay in this context because we're not using it for anything else. If you didn't want to modify the string, you could make a copy of this string variable, which we will get to in a minute. It's kind of a helpful built-in feature of methods and functions. But yeah, we could say like string s copy equals s, and then use this instead of our s variable down here. So now these effectively do the same exact thing. Again, just going back to your question, how do you know to use substring? It really just comes with practice. The more coding you do, the more patterns you'll recognize. Like, oh, I need to solve this particular task. That means I'm going to have to use this particular line of code. So you get that association. So hopefully that answered your question. Again, if any other questions, please put them in the chat and I will read. Okay, so now we can print out the number of A's in the string. And now we can actually put our string in here because we're no longer modifying it. And then we can put our count. So we get this output. The number of A's in the string, this whole thing, is 7. So we found 7 A's in this string. And I'm sure if someone wanted to sit there and count all the A's and manually verify that, they could, but I am just going to believe my code. I'm not going to do that. Okay. Now, this accurately solves the problem we were trying to solve. We wanted to know how many times the letter A appears in this string. But now, what if we wanted to do this again, but for the letter B separately, like in the same code here? We would have to rewrite this code, as well as these 2 lines up here. We would need to reinitialize our count, recopy the string over, because we modified it down here, and then print this line out again, except we'd be referring to the letter B. Well, instead of rewriting all this code out and wasting a lot of time, we could put this code into something called a method or function. So there is technically a difference between the two, the word method and function, but most people use the names interchangeably. And we haven't gone over the material that's required to understand the exact technical difference. So for the rest of this workshop, both names will be referring to the same thing. I'll just use them interchangeably. So what is a method? A method is a block of reusable code. Sometimes this code requires an input in order to work. Sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on the method and what specifically it's doing. Specifically, it relies on something called the method header or method signature. So before we get into more technical stuff and definitions and whatnot, I am just going to provide an example of putting this code inside of a method. So we could say public static void print char occurrences. So we can pass in a string s. So this string is going to represent what we're going through and counting or locating letters within. And then we also need to know what char we're looking at. So we can say char c. And now we have a method. So inside these two curly brackets, we'll put the code in there that's going to be reusable. As many different letters as we want to count, this method should work for all of them. So now if I copy this part, because this is really all we need, and paste it in here, and then we'll change this back to s. Now this code is still specifically counting the letter A, but we want it to count whatever this char is that's being passed into the method. And I keep using that word passed in. I will go into more detail on what exactly that means later on. I also think I spelled occurrences wrong. I think there's 2 R's and possibly 1 C. I don't know. Someone spell check that for me. Anyway, so we have our count initialized to 0. And now instead of while s dot contains the letter A, we want to know while it contains this char C. So we can put C here, but now it's going to ask for a string. So we can just do a simple plus the empty string to convert that to a string. This is another quick shortcut that you can use to easily convert most data types to a string. So you can do this with numbers, chars, just those primitive types. So now it's looking for this char, whatever character is being passed right here. Whenever it finds it, increments count, and then it's going to set the substring to the location of that character plus 1. Someone asked, can you restate the goal of the program? So this one, the goal of this is counting any letter that we ask for. And so it'll be more clear once we actually run the program what this is doing. But this is the same, we're solving the same problem as before, but we're generalizing it. So now we're not just asking for the letter A, we can ask it any letter we want, and it'll tell us how many times it appears in the string. So now instead of the number of A's, now it's the number of this char. And the syntax for the string kind of looks a little wonky. That's going to happen sometimes with your print statements, and that's okay. So now we don't need this line. And if I run this code, you'll notice nothing happens. Even though we wrote out all this code, it's not run. It's not doing anything. And that's because I mentioned before that this is a reusable block of code, which means it can be used as many times as we want, including 0 times. So if we never call this method, if we never tell it to run, it won't run. So we have to make a call to print char occurrences, and we're going to pass in our string, and then some character we want to count. So if we put in that A again, now we get the exact same output that we had for it. I guess we should bring out S, and then we can just put out S here. Okay, so now we have the exact same output that we had before. So here we're still counting the letter A. Now if we want to count the letter B, which I don't think there are any, but I could be wrong. Maybe I didn't save it. Okay, there we go. I just needed to save it. Okay, now it's counting the letter B's, which there are none, so we get a 0 for that. We count the number of H's, which is, keep reading to save, which is 1. We can count O, which is 4. So now all we have to do is just change this one letter. And our program, what it's doing, completely changes. We can count A's, O's, H's, B's, C's, whatever letter we want, we just have to pass it in here. And I can even make this method call as many times as I want in the program itself. So we could do all the vowels, A, E, I, O, and U. And then when I run this, we have 5 different print states. So this code here between these brackets is being reused 5 different times. And every single time it runs, our input is just a little bit different. So now I want to back up out of this example because I just wanted to show you the idea behind a method and what it does. Now I want to kind of go into those definitions and those explanations so that we can all be on the same page here. So just like how we declare variables before we use them, we also have to declare methods. So the syntax for declaring a method is as follows. Put it here. We have the access modifier, which basically means where can this method be called? Where do we have access to this method? And more oftentimes than not, it will be public. And then the second most common one is private. So those are the 2 main ones, but there are a couple others. So we have the access modifier, and then we have the static keyword. As far as the static keyword goes, this is another thing where we haven't gone over the material to explain what the static keyword means. But for now, we're just going to use the static keyword for all our methods. And anytime you write a method in the near future, until you get to classes and objects, you will also use the static keyword. So they have the access modifier, the static keyword, then we have the return type, which is the information that the method sends back, if any. So sometimes methods won't send any information back. Then we have the name of the method, and this is how we refer to the method itself. Then we have parentheses, and inside those parentheses, we have our parameters. The parameters just dictate what information do I have to send to the method in order for it to work? What is the input for this method? And then after this, we have the curly brackets and the body of the method. Okay, so once a method is declared, once we write out this whole thing, so here's an example method header for the method that we wrote earlier. Once it's declared, then a method can be called. So in Java, the location of the method itself doesn't matter, as in this method is down here on line 18, but we're calling it on lines 7 through 11. So even though if you were to read this like a book, top to bottom, print char occurrences doesn't appear until down here. In Java, this does not matter. This is okay. As long as that method exists when you run the program, that's what matters. So I can put the method down here. I can put it all the way at the top. Doesn't matter. It will work as long as it exists. Okay, so now let's look specifically at this. If we compare this method header that we wrote with the syntax up here, so here's our access modifier. Public means the method can be called from anywhere, doesn't matter what. We need this static keyword because if you notice, this is also a method header. This is called the main method, and it's how Java knows where to start running your code. So since main is static, this method, which is called from the main method, also needs to be static. Again, I will go over what static means once I go over the classes and objects workshop, which is in the future, I think in 2 weeks specifically. Our return type here is void. So void means this method does not return anything. It does not send any information back. The code just runs and then it stops running. We could change this method so that it does send information back. And in this case, it would return the number of occurrences for whatever letter we're asking about. So if I change this to int, now we get an error because we're not returning. So if you have a non-void return type, you have to return some information. So here we can just return count, because count is essentially the answer to this question. How many times does A appear in the string? It appears count number of times. So this is what we want. And what that means is if I go up here and I make a call to print char occurrences, I pass in this string and I pass in the letter A. Now this method call will return a piece of information back. It will return an int, which means I can store that int in a variable. So the number of A's equals print char occurrences S, comma A. So however many times A appears in the string, that's what number is going to be stored in this variable because we're returning count. Count was the number of times a certain letter appeared. So it gets sent back up here. So I keep mentioning the phrase passing in. And what that means is when we make a call to this method, we need to give it a string because it's asking for a string right here. And we need to give it a char. So those values get passed in to the parentheses. So when it runs, see if I can annotate this. So that this string value here gets passed in and referenced by this string variable down here. So let me rename one of these variables because I think having them contain the same name might be a little confusing. So I'll call this str, and I'm going to make all of these say str instead. So now when I call this method, print char occurrences, and I put str here, that's this string value up here, it's getting copied and then sent down here. So this is referred to as being passed in to the method. So this variable s receives that copy of string that was sent from up here. And now whatever this method does down here on this s variable, that s variable is whatever we put as str. So let me delete these again for a second. And instead of putting in str, I'm just going to put abc. So ABC is our string that's getting passed in and stored in this variable. And then the letter A, which I will make a capital A, there is a difference. This capital A is going to be stored in this variable, C. And when I run it, it says the number of A's in the string ABC is 1, which is exactly what we'd expect. So this string ABC gets passed in and stored here, and this char A gets passed in and stored here. So that's what it means when somebody says a variable is passed in or a value is passed in. Another thing that I want to point out, sometimes you'll hear references to parameters and arguments. So the parameters here dictate, okay, in order for me to run this method, this is the information you have to give. So I need a string and I need a char. Those are my parameters. when we look at the values that are actually being passed in, so the string ABC and the char capital A, these are the arguments. They're the actual values that are being passed in. So in this case, our method has two parameters. We need to pass in a string, we need to pass in a char. If we don't, our code will not work. If I delete those arguments, now we get an error. This error says the method print char occurrences, which takes a string and a char, is not applicable for the arguments blank. So if we don't pass in any arguments, this method's not going to work. Similarly, if we pass in the wrong kind of arguments, it will also know. If I pass in the number 123 and then a string of the letter G, we get an error that string char, blah, 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 is not applicable for the arguments int string. So not only do we need the correct number of arguments, but the argument types need to be the same. And the order needs to be the same as well. If I make this the string ABC and then put the char A over here, it's still wrong. The order matters. So even though we have the right types, they're in the wrong order. And one of the fixes is to swap A and ABC. So now this is the way that it needs to be written for the code to work. Sometimes you'll have a method that doesn't take any parameters at all. So if we had a method, public static, and we'll say this method doesn't return anything either, so void. And all this method does is just print the word hello. So it doesn't take any parameters, any arguments, doesn't return anything, just performs this task, and then it's done. So now we can call print hello, and then we don't have to put anything in the parentheses. It's just print hello, parentheses, done, move on. And it will print the word hello, the method ends, we get sent back to where we called it, and then we move on. So when we run a method or function, we refer to it as calling that function or calling that method. Just another piece of terminology in programming. And whenever you see a word followed by parentheses, such as this, that's how you know we're calling a method. So we have print occurrences followed by parentheses. So that's a method call. Print hello followed by parentheses. That's a method call. Down here, we have s.contains followed by parentheses. So that's a method call to the string class. Same with substring, index of, system.out.println is another one. So anytime you have that, you are making a method call. And that's how you can recognize. Okay, so now I want to go back to something that I mentioned a while ago when I said that when we're writing methods, each method has a unique method signature. So a method signature is a unique identifier, such as your fingerprint, that every method has. So a method signature is defined by its name and its parameters. For example, we have this public static void print hello. So print hello is the name, and it takes no parameters. That is the signature of this method. This method is called print char occurrences, and it takes a string and a char. That is the signature of this method. So both the name and the parameters are different, which is fine. The reason that the method signature is the name and the parameters is because that's how the method is called. So when I make a call, print occurrences, I put the name and then pass in the arguments equal to the parameters. The same number of parameters, the same type as the parameters. That's how Java knows this is the method we're trying to call. Now, if I have two different methods, we'll call them method one, public static void, method one, this, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't matter for this example. If I try to write that method a second time, now we have an error on both of them. So it says we have a duplicate method called method one in our class. You can only have one method per signature in this class. If I had a different class, I could put it in there as well, but that's not what we're talking about. So since both these methods have the same signature, if I were to call method one, Java would have no way of knowing which one I'm referring to. So if we did have these methods do sysout A and sysout B, there's no way to predict which one I actually want to call because they are identical. However, if I added a parameter to one of these methods, if I put int num, now suddenly it's okay because this method has a different signature than this method. So if I'm back up here, if I call method one with the empty parentheses, that means I'm trying to call this version of method because there's nothing in the parentheses. So this should print out a capital A, and it does. So this method call, method one, with no arguments in it, is referring to this method. If I pass in a number in here, if I put 10, now it prints out B because this method one takes in a number. Even though it doesn't do anything with that number, it's still the fact that the method signature is different than this one. So Java is able to differentiate the two. And then going back to the idea that the order of the variables matters as well, we could say string s and int num for this method one, and then int num string s. And these method signatures are still considered unique because the order is different. So I could go up here and pass in a string and the number 10, and that prints out B. So that's this method here. So we have string, then number. But if I swap the order, if I put 10, then a capital S, now it prints out A. So we changed none of the values. We didn't change the name of the method. All we did was swap the order, and Java knew which one we were referring to. So when we have multiple methods with the same name and a different number of parameters or different types or different order, this is called method overloading. So we're telling Java, I want 2 or more different methods that essentially perform the same task, but the way that they perform it might be different. They perform the same task, but on different variables. So a reason we might want to do this is, let's say we have a method where we want to pass in 2 numbers, multiply them together, and return the result. Well, I could say public static int multiply, and then we would take 2 ints, int a and int b, int x and int y, or int num1, num2, however you want to name your variables. It doesn't matter, but I'm going to use a and b. So the point of this method is we multiply a and b together and return the result. So we can say return a times b. So we're multiplying a and b together. If I come up here and call this method, int result equals multiply 5 times 4. And then if I sys out or system.out.println the result, we get 20. It's 5 times 4 is 20. So this is all fine and good. But now what happens if I put a 5.0 and a 4.5 here? Now suddenly our method doesn't work. It says the method multiply int, int is not applicable for the arguments double, double. So what this means is this method that we wrote down here asks for 2 int type variables, but we're trying to pass in a double, a number with a decimal point, and it doesn't like that. Well, what we can do is have another method called multiply, which does take a double, and then this would do the same exact thing, turn a to b. And now we're getting an error because this returns a double, but we're trying to store it in an int, so we'll change this to double result. And now we get the 22.5, which is 5 times 4.5. So both of these methods down here are performing the same action, but they're doing it with different data types. The first one returns, this one down here returns a product of 2 doubles, whereas this one returns the product 2 int. So it might seem kind of trivial that Java is so nitpicky about this, but there is a reason for it. It keeps your data types strict, which it helps when you're writing code. Java is ensuring that you're doing exactly what you want to, and you're not making a mistake that happens to work out. So one of the reasons I don't like JavaScript, and I'm kind of indifferent on Python, is that they have dynamic typing, which means I can make a variable, store a number in it, take that same variable and store a string in it. And Python and JavaScript have no problem with that. But then you introduce the problem of, well, at any given time, what data type is this variable? So it can become kind of confusing in that regard, which is why I like this strict typing of Java, which a lot of people don't like, which is fine. Anyway, that's all just to say, sometimes you have to overload methods, and this is how you would do it, and that is why you would have it. So I want to, in these last roughly 10 minutes that we have, I want to open up the floor to any questions that, maybe you were kind of mulling over that you haven't asked yet, or if there was anything that we just talked about with overloading. If you have questions about that, I want you to walk out of this workshop with no questions. That is my goal. And I promise there are no stupid questions. How long does it take to memorize all this? That's a good question. As far as like memorizing it, the only thing you really have to memorize per se is just this syntax here. So how to write a method. So you always start with your access modifier. Sometimes you'll have the static keyword. And in this case, if you're starting out in Java, you will always have this static keyword for your methods. Then return type, name of the method, all that. But what's nice though, is when you create a new Java program, when you include this main method, there's your syntax for you. It's all written out, so you can reference it when you're writing new methods. So you always start with the access modifier. So most of the time, public, then the static keyword, the return type, the name of the method, and then whether it takes any parameters or not. So, and it's also different for everyone, like how long does it take to memorize, how long did it take to memorize the alphabet? How long did it take to memorize your phone number or something like that? So it's just different for everyone. And it also is dependent on how often you're programming. If you're making it a point to sit down and program every single day, this will come a lot easier than if you do it once a week. Because the way that our brains are set up is something that's more common. It's going to dedicate more room in your memory for that specific activity. So if you're programming every day, your brain will realize, oh, this is something that I need to make sure that I'm retaining, rather than, oh, I just had to do this one time and then I'm going to forget everything afterward. So I can't stress enough how important it is to practice programming as much as possible, especially when you're first starting out, because it really is like learning a new language. And if you don't use it, you lose it. But that's a good question. Just to confirm, what is a function, or are we safe just assuming it is a method? So I really don't want to go into the technical differences right now. There is a difference. Again, most people even just use those terms interchangeably. So you're fine calling it a function or a method. In fact, different programming languages, like they only refer to it as functions. So Java is specific where it calls them methods. Basically, if it has the static keyword, it's a function. If it doesn't, it's a method. That's like the easiest way that I could describe the difference between a method and a function. But they're doing the same. It's just a block of reusable code that you can call whenever you want, as long as it's within the access modifier's realm. So an example of how this access modifier works, if I set this to private and I were to go to a different class and try to call this function, it wouldn't work because I don't have access to it. It's not public. If you're interested in learning about the different access modifiers, there's only, I want to say 4 of them because it's public, private, package, and protected, the 4 Ps. So that's an easy way to remember them. There are plenty of different things explaining them online. Again, I don't want to confuse you more than I already have, but a little bit of confusion is always good because then that gets you thinking. I just don't want to add too confusion. But to go back and re-answer your question again, you're safe just getting a method, especially dealing with Java. Any other questions? Again, there are no dumb questions. How to assign the appropriate variable? Do you mean in the parameters or the return type? Or are you referring to when you call the method and you pass in an argument? Passing in an argument. So what's nice about Eclipse, if you're using Eclipse, it'll tell you if you're doing it wrong, which is always nice. So if I go back to this multiply method that we have down here, if I delete this double one, Java is telling me, or Eclipse is telling me, hey, you're trying to pass in a double, and this method does not take a double. It takes 2 ints. So we have int A, int B. So when I call this method, that means I have to pass in 2 ints, which it just means I have to get rid of this decimal point. And now it works. So the method header will tell you exactly what you need to type in. Again, working with Java and programming as a whole, more and more, you'll get used to what are the different data types, what are they primarily used for, which one should I be using when I'm writing my methods, and it'll be like second nature. The difference between a char and a string, for example, I could put this call to print char occurrences. If I do S and then A or something like that, we get an error because we're trying to pass in 2 chars, whereas this method takes a string and a char. But if I put quotes around this S instead of if I put double quotes instead of single quotes, now Eclipse has no problem. It can run. So the difference between a string and a char is the quotes that you put it in. And also string, you can put as many letters as you want into this, in between those the double quotes, and it's fine. A char, you can only put a single character. So if I try to put a T, now it doesn't like it because there's 2 characters. So it's an invalid character constant, but it's just another one of those things where you pick up on like exactly how do strings and chars compare. What is a string fundamentally? But an easy way to remember the difference between strings and chars are like when to use the single quotes, when to use the double quotes. A single quote, we only have a single character. Double quotes, you can have as many as you want, including none at all. This is also a valid string, as we did down here. This empty string is as referred to. So hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, please feel free to phrase it a different way. Is there a Java dictionary that defines most common Java keywords, objects, declarations, techniques, assignment techniques? Kind of. So when it comes to programming, the internet is your best friend, 100%. Like, don't be scared to look up certain things, how to do this specific task. Specifically, there is a Java documentation, and that will give you like, okay, here's the string class. Here's what a string is. Here's how to use it. Here are all the different methods that you can call in the string class. So someone asked earlier, how do you know to use the substring? If you look at the documentation for the string class, it lists, okay, here's the contains method. It takes in a string and it performs this specific function. Here's the substring method. It takes a string, or it takes a number, or it can take 2 numbers, or it can take some other thing, blah, 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 and it performs this specific function. So the Java documentation or Java docs, those will also be your best friend specifically for Java. And they're really easy to find. If you just type in, like if you want to define the string class, for example, if you go into Google and you type in string Java docs, it's the first thing that comes up. As far as like best practices for Java, there are a lot of very smart people who make YouTube videos explaining the process of programming and what you should be doing, what you should not be doing. A great example that I have right off the top of my head, he doesn't cover Java, but he covers Python. His name is mCoding. Great, very, very brilliant YouTuber. Highly recommend him. He does cover a lot of very technical stuff, but he'll provide a whole spectrum, a whole range of like, okay, here's some of the more basic stuff, here's some more technical stuff, all in the same video. but he's great if you're ever wanting to learn Python or if you just want programming practices in general, because a lot of the ideas that he mentions you can apply to any language. So I hope that answered your question as well. Are there any other questions? Google Java docs string for string methods. Yes. Yeah. If you'll just type, and actually, let me see if I can provide an example. Let me share. I use Opera instead of Chrome or Firefox. It works better. If I type in string Java docs, again, it's the first thing that comes up. Click on this, the Oracle Help Center. That's where it's located line. And now this tells you everything about the string class. So it's a subclass of object because everything is in Java. It implements these interfaces, which if you don't know what that means, that's okay. Strings are constant. Their values cannot be changed after they're created. String buffers support mutable strings. So you'll see mutable and immutable used a lot. So immutable just means that you can't change it after you declare it. Mutable means you can change them. And all that means is like if I were to say, okay, here's the string ABC and I want to change the B to a D, I can't just change, like alter the string. I have to redeclare it as a new string. But this gives you how to use it, what exactly is going on. Here are some examples of how strings can be used. It gives a lot of detail about strings. Then you have the constructor summary. Here's all the different ways that you can create a string variable. Whenever you see deprecated, that means it's not being supported anymore. It should still work, but it's not being like updated and they're advising you not to use it at all if you can avoid it. So those are all constructors, how you make a string variable. Then you have the method summary. So this is what I was referring to earlier. There's the char at method. It returns the char value at the specified index. There's the contains method, which we used, dot equals, dot ends with. All of these are very, very helpful. Some of them more helpful than others, such as get bytes. I don't think I've ever used that in my life, but that doesn't mean it's not helpful. So this will give you all the different ways that you can call it. So here's 4 different overloaded versions of the index of method. So you can just pass in a number, pass in 2 numbers, you can pass in a string, or you can pass in a string and a number. So the Java docs, again, your best friend. Please use them like as much possible. If you're ever confused about how does this method work, or what can I do with this object, this string, for example, or the integer class. Any other questions? I'm loving this interactivity. There's a lot of questions today. This is great. Method summary. Is that for all variable types or just string? This is just for the string class. And you can also, you have this like kind of hot bar up here. So if I click method, it'll take me right there. There's no way that every single method you could possibly call for every class in Java, like you would not want to see those next to each other. There's thousands. But if there's a specific class, like another class that I've used this for is the calendar class. So if I do calendar Java docs, again, first thing that comes up. So here's another class that you can use. This is for using like date and time functionality, which is very nice. Here's how you create a calendar object. Here's all the specific nuances of the calendar class and what it's doing, how to use it, blah, blah, blah. If we scroll up to the top, if I go to methods, here's all the methods I can call on the calendar object. So I clone it. I can return whether or not something, if this time is before this other time. A very, very helpful class in that regard. What are constructors? Constructors, again, you'll cover those when you get to classes and objects, but you can think of them as just making a new variable. So let me go back to Eclipse. You can think of this when I say like string str equals this whole thing, we're constructing a new string object, a new string variable. Another example, if you've ever worked with a scanner, scanner input equals new scanner system.in, like this. If you ever see this new keyword, that's a dead giveaway that you're calling a constructor. We're constructing a new scanner. And I mentioned before, whenever you see something, a word followed by parentheses, this is a method, technically. So a constructor is just a special kind of method that creates or constructs a new variable. Great question. Any other questions? Will we get a copy of the program I used? If you want me to send you this, if you want me to send you this program, I can. That's not a problem. I guess if you want me to send you this, just send me an email or send me a message in the chat or whatever, letting me know, and I'll get this sent to you. Just so I'm not sending a Java file to everybody who's registered for the workshop. Okay, yeah, I'll get that sent. No problem. Any other questions? Give it another second here in case somebody's typing. All right. Well, it looks like that's everybody's questions answered. So that's going to be it for this workshop. If there's another question that you think of, or still didn't want to ask in the chat, and you want to ask me personally, you can email me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But that's going to be it for this workshop. Hopefully, this was helpful, and I also hope to see all of you in the workshop in 2 weeks for classes and objects. We'll finally cover all of the topics I've been alluding to. All right. Have a good one.